Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Searching for Aliens. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 35 to 40-minute presentation and then he'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Seth Shostak is Senior Astronomer and Institute Fellow at the SETI Institute in California. He has an undergrad degree in physics from Princeton University and a doctorate in astronomy from the California Institute of Technology. For much of his career, Seth conducted radio astronomy research on galaxies and has published approximately 60 papers in professional journals. Dr. Shostak has written 600 popular magazine, newspaper, and web articles on various topics in astronomy, technology, film, and television. He has also written, edited, and contributed to a half-dozen books. His most recent tome is Confessions of an Alien Hunter, a Scientist's Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, published by National Geographic Books. And you can reserve that through the library. And he is co-author of a college textbook on astrobiology. Every week, he hosts the SETI Institute's one-hour science radio show, Big Picture Science. Over to you, Dr. Shostak, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's always a pleasure to talk to people in Massachusetts because, you know, the light is always on in Massachusetts. At least that was the BG, and I think that's the Baltimore group says. And so I hope that, you know, you have your no-dos at the ready and maybe some strong coffee. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we think there might be aliens out there, how we're looking for them, and maybe even something about what that might mean for you, the car buyer. I have to say that, you know, I'm going to talk to you not only about the traditional sort of work we look at, but also about the possibility that aliens are visiting Earth. Deborah had suggested to me that many of you may have read in the papers about this report that was dropped onto the desks of your Congress people in late June, talking about, you know, who's teasing our Navy top guns by darting in and out of our atmosphere. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. So, you know, I can only say that while the following may be somewhat tedious, it will also be soporific. So without any more, you know, palaver from me, I'm going to share my screen here, and that may actually allow you to see a slide or two. So here we go. Okay, I assume that that is sort of working. And let me come over here. Oops, sorry, wrong slide. Okay. I never get this right. See, looking for aliens is a lot easier than showing a PowerPoint slide. Okay, everybody see that? Deborah, you're nodding your head affirmatively, or maybe you're just nodding off. All right, we're going to look for ET. I work at the SETI Institute. You've already heard that from Deborah. The SETI, you know, SETI just stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's almost my name, but that's strictly a coincidence. In other words, we're not just looking for life in space. There are plenty of people doing that, mostly who work for NASA or one of the other space agencies in the world. But we're looking for the intelligent variety of aliens, the kind that you see every night on the tube, or perhaps at your local Cineplex, if you have the guts to go to the local Cineplex. So why do we even think that there are aliens out there? I occasionally get asked at parties, well, Seth, do you really think there are aliens out there? I mean, I think it's a kind of crazy question because obviously I wouldn't have the job I have if I didn't think that there were aliens out there, right? But, you know, you might justifiably wonder, well, wait a minute, Earth is kind of special. Maybe there aren't any aliens out there. Well, here's the reason. It's not that we found them. We haven't. But there's a lot of space for them, right? Otherwise, this whole thing would be a waste of space, to quote Jodie Foster. This number here, which I think is like a 10 to the 22, is the number of stars that we can see with our telescopes. Well, galaxies, stars, and sorry, each galaxy has, a few 100 billion stars, something like that. That's a lot of star pleasure. That's a lot of stars. Now, what we didn't know up until rather recently was, well, okay, good, but how many of those stars actually have planets? And the answer to that question is essentially all of them do. Something you wouldn't have learned if you had gone to maybe the Boston Museum of Science in your youth and gone through the planetarium show back in the day, which wasn't so long ago. People didn't know whether planets were commonplace or rare. They just didn't know because they're very hard to see. But now, thanks to some very clever experiments, we know that planets are about as common as fire hydrants. I mean, they're just everywhere. They're everywhere. So there are a lot of planets. Most of them are not so interesting, but some are. This is just a little chart maintained by the University of Puerto Rico. You can find it on the web, of course. These are some of the planets that have been discovered in the past couple of years that look like they might be somewhat similar to Earth. Don't pay any attention to the, the little artwork on each of these balls. So that's total fiction. Nobody knows what they look like up close. But the bottom line here is that roughly 1 out of every 2 or 3 stars, like the sun, and the sun is a very common sort of star, 1 out of every 2 or 3 seems to have a planet roughly the same size as the Earth and at the same average temperature of the Earth, so that there could be, oceans, atmosphere, all that good stuff that we're busy changing now. Okay, so it looks like there's a lot of real estate for ET, and if there's a lot of real estate, maybe there's a lot of, maybe there are a lot of ETs too. Now, before I go any further with how we might find them, here at the SETI Institute, let me discuss briefly the possibility that all of that is kind of unnecessary because the aliens are here, right? Now, this is a photo from a book that I had when I was in the 7th grade, which was, just before the Civil War had begun. And you can see here what they called flying saucers back then. That's the whole story in itself. But you can see one of the aliens standing there behind, I don't know what, a control panel. Obviously, this is not a great design for a spacecraft because, it's very hard to get the furniture up against the walls when they're all curved like that. But still, back in the 1950s, this is what people said was happening in our skies, that there were these flying saucers. Well, I mean, 1/3 of the American public does believe that we are being visited. It's 1/3, 1 out of every 3 of your neighbors thinks that, yep, the government's keeping it quiet, but we're being visited by aliens who, make crash landings in Roswell or whatever they do. After all, you do see them on television. So could there not be aliens that are visiting? Well, doesn't violate physics, but the evidence, to my mind, is very poor. Now, I consider this one of the best of the UFO photos, but I say that somewhat immodestly because I made this photo in my garage. This is a lampshade that I found in an abandoned shopping cart here in California. But this photo has appeared on the covers of several magazines, but now it's totally fake. All right, anyhow, these are the results. I think this is instructive of, unlike some of this other stuff. This is the result of some polls that were made not too long ago about how people regard the idea that aliens may be in our airspace. All right, the purple on the left, 3/4 of the American public thinks that, yeah, ET life exists. All right, that's not a biggie. The next one is, what fraction of, that's just a different age group. The blue bar is the fraction of Americans that think extraterrestrials visit Earth. And you can see that's 40%, right? 1 out of 3 again, which is roughly what it is. They think we are being visited. The bar all the way on the right, the 2% of Americans think that the aliens are not only here, but they occasionally abduct people, hauling them out of their bedrooms for experiments that their moms wouldn't approve of. So this is just to show that, in fact, there's a very, very widespread belief, even to the extent of being almost a religious belief. They're so convinced that indeed aliens are here and the government's keeping it quiet. All right, you may still think that's true after I give you all these reasons why I don't think it's true, but that just happens. To begin with, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think that the aliens have come all this way to visit us because, well, the amount of energy it takes to fly from one star system to another is not trivial. It isn't like, You know, in Star Trek, Captain Kirk just calls up Scotty in the engine room, tells him to put the pedal to the metal, and off they go at more than the speed of light. You know, well, that works on television. It just doesn't work in science. Okay. I mean, even to go close to the speed of light requires an enormous amount of energy. This is not an engineering problem. This is a physics problem. So, you know, you got to take that into account. Going from one star to another is not something you can do easily, if at all. The other thing is, what about the evidence that we're being visited? Now, here's one of the many photos you can find on the web of UFOs. And this looks like, I don't know, sort of a jet plane, but presumably it's not, because nobody, you know, saw a jet plane in the skies. But this is an artifact of the kind of cameras you have in your, you know, smartphone, right? They have a different kind of shutter than a camera that you might have that is a traditional camera, where, you know, some sort of mechanical device opens up the film or the sensor to light, and then after a fraction of a second, it closes again. But that's not the way shutters work in in cell phones. They're electronic shutters, and the consequence of the way they work, and this is something for you to study this weekend if you have nothing else to do, causes this kind of elongation of objects. In this case, most likely a bird. Okay, so it looks like something that isn't a bird, but in fact is totally compatible with being a bird. All right, now, those of you who subscribe to the papers, if any of you remember what a paper is, may have noticed that at the end of 2017, there was quite a bit of buzz in the press about some videos that had been leaked by the US Navy showing strange phenomena in the skies. Now, these photos were made by certain kind of cameras on board some F-18 Super Hornet aircraft, fighter jets. And this is a frame from one of these videos. I think many of you will have seen this. All right, so you see this black thing there. Now, again, this is an infrared camera. So what that means is it's sensitive to heat, right? And things that are dark in this photo are things that are hot. Okay, that's the way this works. So there's something hot, apparently, in front of the camera, far away, and it, you know, kind of twists and turns, and it looks very appealing. Couldn't that be an alien craft? You know, that maybe the Klingons have come all the way to Earth to tease our top guns. Well, maybe, but let me wait, hold it. There you go. Remember, this is looking for heat. And so it could be that what you see is that black, funny looking thing there in the center of the image is in fact a distant aircraft. Right? When I say distant, maybe 50 miles off. You know, when you're up at 22,000 feet, which was about the altitude of the plane here that made the photo, you can certainly see something 50 miles away, right? That's something you can prove to yourself. So maybe it was just an airplane so far away, you couldn't see it as an airplane. And since you have a camera that's sensitive to heat, that plane, if it's flying away from you, has these jet engines. Maybe it's a 2-engine jet, maybe it's a 4-engine jet, but in any case, there's a lot of heat looking up the tail of those airplane engines, right? So maybe you would see those, except of course, it's far away. So, you know, it gets kind of blurred like that. And that looks very much like that. Okay, so I'm not saying that that's what that thing is in the Navy video, but it's something it could be, and it doesn't involve aliens. So you have to be a little bit critical. The other thing is that here's a plot of when Americans most often see UFOs, right? You see working hours on the left and sleeping hours on the right, but most of the reports are during drinking hours. Now, I don't know if that means anything, but you know, it's worth considering that the aliens have made themselves visible only at cocktail time. I get calls every day, emails every day from people who are having difficulties with aliens in their personal lives. Okay. In some cases, they just have seen something. That's the majority of cases. Other cases, the aliens have kind of moved in with them. And sometimes people complain that the aliens are taking over the spare bedroom or whatever. One case from somebody near Sacramento wrote, she said that, no, it was a guy actually. He said that the alien had moved in, but was becoming troublesome because he was now insisting that the owner of the house teach him English so that he could read the newspapers. I didn't know what to do about that, but those are the kinds of calls I frequently get. Now, that isn't to say that these people are calling me up are either all bonkers or lying. I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I can't think of a single call I've gotten where I thought, oh, this person's just having me on. It doesn't happen. They're very sincere, and I try to help because, after all, you can't just continually throw out the infant with the bathwater. You gotta at least look at some of these things, right? And so, I try to help out. If they have photos, if they have videos, I'll look at those, and sometimes I can help them with that because photography happens to be a longtime hobby of mine. So I recognize when things are due to optics and that sort of thing. But here's something that the UFO crowd doesn't like to talk about too much, or at least doesn't talk about. This is just a graphic indicating where all the orbiting satellites are around the Earth. It's kind of crowded up there, particularly up at about 150 or 200 miles. There's a lot of stuff flying around up there. If anybody who saw the film Gravity, was it? I think it was Gravity. Anyhow, knows, these things actually very, very seldom collide with one another, but it happens often enough that it's becoming a problem. Anyhow, that's a different story for a different time. But the point is that of these roughly 4,500 satellites up there that are, operational, about 1,000 of them, a little less, are actually looking down. And they're doing things like the weather maps that you see on the nightly news, the clouds formation and all that stuff. They're doing that sort of thing, or they're doing surveillance, maybe for the military, maybe for somebody else's military. There are almost 1,000 of those things. And while, if you go on Google Earth, you can see, the result of this sort of surveillance from satellites. I mean, you can find your car right in the driveway on those Google Earth maps. Well, photos, really. There are, obviously, there are satellites that have much higher resolution than just an entire car. And in fact, some of them can see very, very small stuff. So you would think that if there really were alien craft sailing around our skies, that some of these satellites would have seen them, right? And you say, oh, well, the U.S. government is just covering up. I have to tell you, I've worked for the U.S. government. I was never impressed by their ability to cover up anything, but okay, maybe. But then what about all the other governments? Are they all covering up? Because these satellites are not all American satellites. So there is that. And there's also the fact that there are a lot of amateur astronomers in the world, not just in the United States. And if there are as many as 500,000, there are probably more, they should see UFOs. If there are UFOs, they should see them essentially every week. There are also radar sets, at every airport, really, and also radar defense setups that can see, well, a marble 100 miles up, right? They don't find the UFOs. So I think that the UFO community is hard up against this fact that there doesn't seem to be any corroborating evidence for what they claim. I will finish here on this whole business about the aliens to say that, and these are some aliens that visited me. They came in at dinner time and I really didn't have enough food to offer them. But if the aliens really are here, if you think they are here, and again, it's not an unusual belief. If you think they are here, you have to admit they're the greatest house guests ever. Right? They don't kill anybody. They don't help us with anything, right? They don't do anything except provide fodder for History Channel documentaries, so-called documentaries on the weekend. That's all they do. They don't, if you go down to Logan Airport or whatever and catch a flight, I mean, the FAA hasn't grounded all those planes thinking that, my God, there are aliens up there. And they haven't filed a flight plan. We better just shut it all down for a while. They never do that. And I think that should tell you something right there. But okay, enough of that. Now, let's talk about another way to find the aliens, because I don't think you're going to find them in our airspace. There's a Harvard professor who's just started a project that was reported in today's press to look for the aliens in our airspace. Good luck to him. I can only applaud the fact that he's willing to try that. I don't think it's going to succeed, but we'll find out. Here's the other way to do it, and this is the way we do it these days. It's based on an idea that's, well, what is it, 60-some years old now. A fellow by the name of Frank Drake, there's Frank. Frank Drake, who was a 30-year-old astronomer back when he did this in 1960, he used what's called a radio telescope. That's just a big antenna. In fact, the very one he used is the one that's in my photo here. And he figured that, well, obviously I could study galaxies or nebulae or, all sorts of astronomical things with this antenna. But what about this? what about pointing this antenna in the direction of some nearby star systems in the expectation that maybe some of them have a planet with aliens on it who are broadcasting signals into space? Either, just sort of accidentally, the way we broadcast our TV into space. It's not that there's much money in doing that, but the signals just sail on out beyond all the suburbs of a city, and they just go right into space. So maybe the aliens are doing this, and we can eavesdrop on them. That was the idea. That was Frank Drake's idea. And he spent 2 weeks using this antenna trying to eavesdrop on the aliens. He didn't hear the aliens, but this stimulated an enormous amount of interest in this scheme for proving that we have some cosmic company. So ever since then, the very small SETI community, when I say very small, the total number of people in the entire world who do this kind of work is, I don't know, maybe 24, right? Some of it is in Massachusetts, but all the rest actually is in California. I don't know if that suggests anything to you, but maybe it should. But we've used antennas around the world, including this one in Parkes, Australia. Anybody who saw the movie The Dish will recognize this antenna. It was kind of the star of that movie. But we have used that for weeks, trying to find signals, and we haven't found any. That's a bottom line, right? And again, at that cocktail party that I get invited to, every 8th year or something, people will say, well, Seth, have you found the aliens yet? Which I find a very peculiar question, because obviously if we had found the aliens, you wouldn't have to ask that question. It would be all over the media. And when I point that out, they come back at me by saying, no, that's not true, because obviously the government would keep it quiet. Now, I don't know if you live in an area where they're very, have these conspiratorial tendencies with regard to our federal government. But I said, well, why would the government keep it quiet? And the usual answer to that is, well, the public couldn't handle the news. I mean, they would just go nonlinear. They would go nuts and they'd start rioting in the streets. Now, I ask you, you don't have to answer this out loud, but if you were to open up your browser tomorrow, right, or look at your phone and see the headlines, and the headlines read, scientists find a signal coming from 872 light years away, would you say, well, that's it, Marge, I'm not going to go to work today. I'm just going to riot in the streets? I mean, I don't think you'd say that. Or if you would, get help. So this is a kind of a phony baloney kind of excuse for the fact that there's this conspiratorial aspect to the whole SETI operation. We haven't found a signal. If we had, you'd know about it. The government couldn't keep it quiet. Now, how do you explain that? Well, there are a whole bunch of, small laundry lists of explanations. The explanations include, well, just there aren't any aliens. I mean, we're it. We're the smartest things in the universe. There are people who think that. I think they mostly live in Framingham. But, there could be, it could be that we are actually special. But, I have to tell you that every time in the past, when scientists tried to explain something by saying we're special, they were wrong. We don't seem to be special. This is a misconception probably inculcated by your parents during the first 15 years of your life. You're special. Okay, so I don't buy that. There aren't any aliens. That doesn't make any sense to me. The second possibility is that they're cryptic. They're just hiding out because, if we knew they were there, we might launch an attack, or I don't know what, maybe send them junk mail. I'm not sure, but it strikes me that, yeah, maybe some of them do try and keep a low profile, but I can hardly believe that they all do that, because that's what's required here. Maybe we just haven't, done enough searching, right? It's like a completely accurate metaphor. Our search for ET is very much like saying, Bob, I'm going to go to Africa and look for, large animals that have prehensile noses that can pick up peanuts and stuff like that. And so you go to Africa, you land on the east coast and west coast of Africa, and you examine one city block of real estate, no elephants. Well, I guess there aren't any, but that would obviously be premature, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't any elephants. You've only looked at one square, one city block worth of Africa. That's completely analogous to our situation now when it comes to looking for ET. We've looked only in a very small part of our galaxy. And So I don't think it means anything. And you might say, well, why? Well, you guys are sloughing off. It's because of lack of money, to be honest. This whole enterprise is funded by donations, and there just isn't that much money to do it. So we haven't looked at enough places, but that's going to change as technology gets better. The other possibility is that we haven't found them because our instruments are not sensitive enough, and that actually, to me, makes some sense. You only have a limited sensitivity because the limits of your technology, right? But, if they were deliberately beaming a signal our way, we probably would have found it by now. But that's unlikely because the aliens actually don't know about us yet. This is a kind of a mysterious chart, but it just shows the stars that are nearest to the sun, right? So kind of a three-dimensional chart here, and they're color-coded on the basis of how hot the stars are and so forth. But you can see these are all stars within about, 60 or 70 light years of where we are. So those are relatively nearby. These are the stars that could have had planets where they might have picked up I Love Lucy, if you will, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie for the people who are really ancient in the audience like me. But that isn't a very large number of stars. That's a terribly small number of stars, a few dozen. So the bottom line of this argument is that, doggone it, the chances that any of these stars also has a sophisticated society that's bothering to monitor signals coming off Earth and then, turn them into pictures and sound, is so small that I'm sure it's not happening. I mean, it doesn't make sense that it's happening. It would be very unusual. And what you take away from that is the aliens don't know about Homo sapiens yet, because this is the only way they could find Homo sapiens. They can't see the Great Wall of China, right? They can't see the chlorofluorocarbons in our atmosphere, none of that. They could perhaps pick up our radar, our FM radio, right, our television. They might be able to do that. But, those signals haven't gotten very far into space yet. So we're still unknown to the majority of the universe, the vast majority of the universe. And you might find that reassuring in some sense. I'm not sure I do, but it is true that the next time your next door neighbor says, well, I'm routinely abducted by aliens, you might point out that why are they coming to improve your social life now? They don't even know about us. Something to think about. All right, let's keep going here. So that's the way we've been looking for ET, trying to eavesdrop with radio telescopes, also with ordinary telescopes, trying to look for flashing lasers. But maybe there's another way to do this, because the problem with this scheme that we've been using so far is that it does make some assumptions that you might quibble with. Let's consider what plan B might be. And that is, forget about looking for signals. Let's just look for things. Let's just look for artifacts, right? The universe, I don't know how many of you have been keeping track since the Big Bang, but that was about 13 billion years ago. So the universe is like 3 times as old as the Earth, right? So there's been plenty of time for societies out there to get millions, even billions of years in advance of ourselves. And if they have, maybe some of them have built something big that we could even see. And if that's true, that has a big advantage if it comes to trying to figure out if we have any cosmic confreres, right? Because you no longer have to worry about the signals from their transmitters getting to us just as we're looking, right? You completely remove that problem, because an artifact, a big thing, well, it's always there. It doesn't have to be there just at the moment you're looking. It's just there, right? So that removes that particular problem, which is a serious problem. The other thing is it removes the possible impediment to any aliens of letting others know they're around. Now, this is Stephen Hawking, who rather famously said 5 or 8 years ago, I don't remember, he said, well, we should be careful about revealing our presence, because after all, you don't know who's out there, and maybe they're aggressive. And, if they find out that, well, that little blue planet over there, it's inhabited, that they might send their interstellar battle wagons to Earth and flatten Los Angeles. I don't know that makes a whole lot of sense. And personally, as a resident of Northern California, I really don't have any problem with the result. But, this solves their problem. You just, they're not going to make any signals, but maybe they build something. Okay, they can't avoid that being something that people could find. The other advantage of looking for artifacts as opposed to signals is that, well, the aliens don't have to be around now, right? If somebody says to me, oh, Seth, I want you to go find the pharaohs, right? See if they can get them to let our people go. Okay, well, you could try and do that. You won't find the pharaohs. Well, you will, but they're, sort of immobile in a museum in Cairo. But what you could find just to the west of Cairo are these big pointy buildings. Okay. And, these are pretty good evidence that there were pharaohs, even though you might not know the word, right? And these things are around all the time. And they're around even when the classical Egyptians are gone. So artifacts have that advantage too. They're just, X on the spot. There it is. And it's there forever. And whatever you look for it, you'll find it. So let me give you some examples of this kind of artifact that we might be talking about. This was one of my thesis advisors. This is Martin Schmidt. It's a photo I made of him a long time ago. But shortly after I got to this school, he was on the cover of Time magazine because he had discovered the quasars. Now, this is not a lecture about quasars, but quasars are, essentially giant black holes in the centers of galaxies that make a lot of radio noise. And for a while, there was a claim by the Soviets, who were also doing this kind of work at the time. They said, look, those signals coming from these things, they're not steady. They're going up and down and up and down and up. It's clearly aliens trying to signal us. Well, that wasn't true, but nonetheless, it was a possibility. Okay. Here's another one, 1967, Jocelyn Bell at Cambridge. She's just a student there, and she's keeping track of some signals coming out of a radio telescope there in Cambridge. And she notices that there's some signals that repeat very precisely. This is a bit of the chart record. And this particular pulsar, as it later became known, every roughly 1.5 seconds a year, 1.5 seconds, as good as the best clock. It was really amazing. And for a while, the people in Cambridge called these LGMs, little green men, because they didn't know what they were. And if they're that regular, maybe it's aliens. Well, it turned out it wasn't. It was dead stars. But, could have been. I'm not going to even talk to you about that. Here's something that's been proposed more recently, and I think is actually sort of nifty. This idea is due to a British physicist, really, although he worked in the US for a lot of his career, Freeman Dyson. And he said, look, you want to solve the energy problem, you want non-polluting energy sources, forget about all those fossil fuels, forget about covering your roof with solar cells. We don't need to do that. What you do is you just take apart some worthless planet like Neptune, right? You probably ought to get buy-in from the Neptunians first, but take it apart and then rebuild it as a giant shell outside the orbit of the Earth, and line the inside with solar cells. So you collect all this energy. It turns out that it's trillions of times more energy than we can possibly use. And then you just beam it down to Earth, and you don't burn anything. There's no pollution. You don't have to go mine anything. It's there forever. Now, if anybody has done this, and this is hard, of course, but it's not impossible for a society that's very much more advanced than we are. I mean, it doesn't violate any physics. You could do this. Well, if somebody's done that, maybe we can find one of these spheres. So people have looked. And indeed, there was the thought that this was responsible for the dimming of a particular star. And this was in the papers a couple of years ago. It turns out it probably wasn't. There's also, by the way, this object. This is Oumuamua. If you speak fluent Hawaiian, you probably noticed my accent. Oumuamua was this object that was seen in 2017, so not so long ago. And it looked like it was just a single pixel on a photo, right? It was clearly very far away. It was like 200 million miles away when it was discovered, but it was in our solar system. And the nifty thing about this thing was not that it looked like something you would want to avoid on the sidewalk. Not that, it's that this thing, on the basis of its orbit, was clearly from somebody else's solar system. This is the first time we'd found an object in our solar system that came from somebody else's solar system. Right? Now, it's not clear which solar system it came from. Turns out that's hard to tell, but it wasn't one of ours. It wasn't one of our comets or asteroids. Now, the people who study comets or asteroids that are in our solar system said, yeah, this is an asteroid, or maybe it's a comet, but, because it's been sailing through space for, maybe 100 million years or something like that. It's all encrusted and funny things have happened to it. And that's why it looks the way it does. It's about the same size as a strip motel right along the Route 1 or something. Okay. But Harvard professor Avi Loeb maintains that this might not be just a rock. This is an artist's impression, right? The real thing probably doesn't look anything like this, but it is going to be longer than it is wide. That much we know. And he's suggesting that maybe this is a bit of Klingon hardware sailing around. Well, I mean, it's hard to tell because this thing is long gone. We can't chase after it. But, this is another example of looking for something that is non-natural, that you can associate with intelligence elsewhere. So I think that makes sense. Well, okay, these are the telescopes that we actually use for our current efforts. This is the Allen Telescope Array. That's not Woody Allen. That's Paul Allen, who was a co-founder of Microsoft, right? Paul Allen, Bill Gates. And in any case, this telescope is about 300 miles north of San Francisco. It's open during, the work week. You can go visit it if you happen to be in the area. I recommend it. It's kind of fun to walk around. But these are the antennas, the set of antennas. There are 42 of these things that we're using now to try and eavesdrop on ET. Having said all that, I think I'm going to shut up and let you ask questions. And Deborah will translate them into Bosnia-Herzegovinian dialect so that I can understand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shostak. That was really fun and fascinating. And we do have some questions, so let's get to those. One viewer writes, "Greetings, my book club just finished reading Contact by Carl Sagan, which of course deals with first contact via radio waves. Is that a likely medium for first contact?" And I think you talked about that a little, but maybe you could just respond to that question directly.
Well, yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, because that's the scheme used by most people who are involved in looking for evidence of extraterrestrials, is to use either radio telescopes, as I have, I've shown you several, and described. That's kind of the default scheme. And it makes sense. You might say, why radio? And I occasionally get emails from people who say, well, radio, it's so old school. Why would the aliens still be using radio? But, they're kind of confusing the technology with the content, right? We use radio for all sorts of things. I mean, your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth, all that's radio. Your television is in fact radio. It's just that they encode information about pictures as well as sound. So all of that makes sense, even for a very advanced society. It's a bit akin to saying, well, will the aliens use the wheel? I mean, that's pretty old school, isn't it? Yes, it is. But, if you have any vehicles that run along prepared guideways, if you will, called roads or rails, then they probably use the wheel. So we assume that this is a good way to communicate. If they're trying to send bits of information from one place to the next, they probably use radio or light, which is also radio, in fact, that kind of scheme. So yeah, it's a good scheme.
Okay. One viewer has a comment, just saying, you must be one of the best people to have at a party.
Well, nobody has ever suggested that's true. Unless I buy all the drinks, maybe, I don't know, but I never do that. No, I made a lot of allusions to going to parties, but I almost never go to parties.
Well, and nobody's gone to parties recently, so.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, here's another question. How likely is it for extraterrestrials sending out self-replicating probes, as in seeding space with proverbial messages in the bottles?
Yeah, well, self-replicating probes were hypothesized by a Princeton mathematician, actually. And, they're kind of a dangerous thing in a way. They're called von Neumann probes because that was the name of the mathematician. Because if you have a self-replicating probe, right, and sort of, that's a lot of words to simply say it's a machine that makes copies of itself, right? Sort of the way the squirrels in my backyard, they make copies of themselves. But, you know, there's a limit to what they can do because there are only so many acorns or whatever they're going to eat, right? Now, but with machines, maybe all they need is a little bit of energy and a little bit of matter. And there's a lot of that in the universe. So if you had self-replicating machines, it's quite conceivable that they would get out of hand. And there would be a kind of a Darwinian evolution that would favor those machines that are the best at self-replicating. It's just like the coronavirus, right? If you can replicate more quickly, then you become the dominant strain in the population. So that would happen with these machines. And, you know, the entire universe might be gobbled up by von Neumann machines. So people have pointed out the fact that you can look at Saturn tonight or Jupiter. Jupiter is near the moon these days, or at least this day. And, you know, you don't see anything gobbling up Jupiter or the moon for that matter. So that tells you that these things are not rampant. They're not everywhere. Maybe a good example of something that's like a von Neumann probe would be insects, right? They're everywhere. They can reproduce in vast numbers, but they don't seem to have eaten everything. You go to your nearest shrub or tree and you'll find little holes in the leaves and so forth because they eat something. But there are other factors that keep them in check. The real question is, well, if you had self-replicating machines, is there anything that would keep them in check? And the answer to that question is, I don't know the answer to that question, but maybe you can, write it up. You can get it published for sure. Why von Neumann probes don't exist. I'd love to read it.
Okay. Here's another question. If we're looking for artifacts, like the one with the Hawaiian name, does that mean we need to wait for them to enter our solar system or wherever it was spotted? How else would we find them?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And Oumuamua was found in 2017. Within 2 years, another object from beyond our solar system was found. It has the less appealing name 2I Borisov, but Borisov was the astronomer, amateur astronomer actually, in Russia who found it, so he gets to name it. But it also comes from another solar system. But in that case, it's very clearly a comet because it has a little tail, okay? So on the basis of 2, which is a very small sample, of course, but on that basis, you would say, looks like every couple of years you can expect to find another one. Now, you won't expect to find one because to find these things requires really a pretty big instrument. And that's probably why we have never found them before. We didn't have the right kind of telescope, and now we sort of do. So, maybe you have to wait a couple of years before there's a new one. If all you're going to look for are these kind of, a rock from another solar system, which might not be a rock. The other thing is that just seeing it on one of these photos, right? It's only a single pixel. It's just a little dot on the photo. And so how do you tell? Is that a rock or is that a Klingon spacecraft? How can you tell? It's very hard, perhaps. And so what you really want to do is fire off some rocket from the Cape and go up and look at it, up close and see if you see portholes along the side with little green faces behind them. That would tell you what it is, but that's hard too, and it's expensive, right? We don't have rockets ready to chase down the next asteroid from somebody else's solar system, and it would be hard to catch up with them anyhow. So that's difficult. All you can do is say, well, I just hope that one of them gets close enough to Earth that we can see it with our telescopes and identify what it is. But look, there are other things. Astronomers are busy every night making photos of this, that, and the other, and maybe they trip across something else that indicates somebody's out there.
Right. Okay. One of our viewers wants to know what you think of Andy Weir's new book, Project Hail Mary, in particular, the alien that's in that story. Are you familiar with the book?
Well, I'm not familiar with the book. I read Andy Weir's first 2 books, and actually, Andy Weir, at the time I read The Martian, he was living here in Mountain View, just about 5 blocks away from here. And actually, we called him up and I said, look, we'd like to interview for our radio show. And within 15 minutes, he was here, actually. He's an extremely nice guy. He's a wonderful guy. But I haven't read the latest book, and I feel guilty about it, so I can't say much about it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I could, but it wouldn't be true.
I haven't read it yet either, but I'm looking forward to it. This same viewer wonders, do you think there could be single cell aliens, quote, infecting the universe as described in his book?
Yeah. Well, that's an old idea, actually. When I say old, I mean several centuries. The idea that you might have a kind of Johnny Appleseed effect in the cosmos where, for example, maybe life got started on Mars when Earth was still without life, still sterile. So 4 billion years ago, no life on Earth maybe, but that there was life on Mars. I mean, it's only, microscopic, but suppose it's living there and there used to be water on the surface of Mars. And so, by chance, a rock comes in, slams into the surface of Mars. That happens all the time, right? And bam, it kicks up some dirt clods, most of which fall right back down. But some of them might be kicked off speedily enough that they escape Mars's gravity, and they just get hurled out into space, where they, in general, just sort of wander around and eventually crash into the sun. But some of those might crash in, or one of them might have crashed into the Earth, right? Landed in a pool of water, or who knows what. And those Martian microbes might have said, well, this is not such a bad place after all, because they would survive that trip. Microbes are really tough, right? So, and so they multiply and they say, this is a great planet when there's no competition here, right? And there's all this stuff we can eat. So, and then they multiply and they diversify, and, Charles Darwin gets to work, and, 4 billion years later, you have Homo sapiens, which would make us Martians. And that's possible. It's possible. I mean, we have no evidence to suggest that's true, but we also don't have any evidence to suggest it's not true. That's a question that can be answered if and when we find any life or remains of life on Mars.
Wow. My mind is officially blown.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you're descended from Martians, you can always hope that, maybe there's a castle on Mars that your family hasn't inherited or something.
Here's another question from a viewer. What's it like to spend a career looking for something that you might not ever find?
Well, to begin with, I haven't done this all my career. I've had many jobs, actually, and not all of them were even in science, for that matter. So it hasn't been all my life. But I think it's a legitimate question, because you might say, well, isn't this a little disappointing? I mean, you just keep doing the same thing over and you wake up to go to the office. Oh, what are you going to do today? I don't know. But in fact, what keeps this interesting is, to begin with, all the dull parts of this job have been coded into software a long time ago. So you're not doing anything very tedious other than answering email, right? But it's also the case that the technology that we're using keeps getting better. Now, as I probably have intimated, I'm sitting here in the middle of the Silicon Valley. Mountain View is where, the Google headquarters is and stuff like that. So a lot of technology around here. And one of the laws of the Silicon Valley, it's actually an economic law, it's called Moore's Law, says that, well, every 2 years, the amount of compute power you can buy for $1,000 or any other given price point doubles. In other words, $1,000 will buy you this computer today, but 2 years from now, that same $1,000 will buy you a computer twice as fast, right? I mean, they just want you to buy new computers, of course, but what that has as a consequence for us is that every 2 years, our search doubles in speed, okay? So that keeps you interested, right? It's, it's like working the crosswords, but every 2 years, the number of words doubles,
So as a follow-up to that, do you think that SETI will find intelligent alien life forms in your lifetime?
Well, of course, there's always a question of what my lifetime means. And I try to be careful crossing the street. So it's more than a week or something. I actually have addressed that by a bet I made informally. I was giving a talk, I think it was in Bremen, Germany or something. And the audience there was, propping up their eyelids with toothpicks or whatever. And I suggested to them, I said, look, I'm willing to bet you all a cup of Starbucks, although I probably didn't say Starbucks because they might not have known what that was. A cup of coffee that by 2035, we will find ET. So that's the deal. I mean, I think that that's true simply because of what I just alluded to there, the Moore's Law improvement in the speed of the search. By 2035 or 2040, we will have looked at 1 million star systems. And, just in my gut, that just sounds like a big enough number of star systems that it's worth a bet of a cup of coffee that we will have success. Now, here's the deal for you. I mean, either by 2035, there's a story in the papers that you can use as a gambit in your conversation at dinner. Oh, they found aliens. Or you get a cup of coffee. So you really can't lose.
Right. 2035. I love that. Okay, here's another question. If you could choose one technological advance that would accelerate the search for ET, what would it be?
Yeah, probably finding gold here. That's probably the real problem with SETI is the money, actually. And I know that people are not interested in hearing about that, so I won't really belabor that. But when I joined the SETI Institute, which, as I may have mentioned, was, I don't know if I did or not, 1990, thereabouts, it was a NASA program. There was a NASA SETI program. But the US Congress killed that by 1993, okay? It was just a vote in the Senate and they killed it. It was for political reasons. Nobody knew what the science was nor cared, but it was for political reasons. But that aside, suddenly there was no money to do this anymore. And fortunately, here in the Silicon Valley, there were some people like Bill Hewlett, David Packard, Paul Allen, Gordon Moore, these people who were willing to give a little bit of their personal fortunes to the furtherance of this experiment. But ever since then, it's been running on private money. So that's a real impediment to succeeding because, I mean, as I say, the total number of people in the world who do this, total number of people in the world is probably fewer than work at the local donkeys, or a couple of donkeys anyhow. They don't call it donkeys anymore, do they? Or maybe they do. Yeah.
Okay, here's another question. Should or can searching be focused upon stars old enough to have advanced developed civilization?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's true too. I mean, there are some stars that are only, they're very young. They're babies, if you will. They're only 100 million years old or 500 million years old. And, I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that even if they have planets that have spawned life, that life hasn't gotten very far, right? It may be still in the single cell stage as it was on Earth right up until like 500 million, 600 million years ago, right? It was all single-celled stuff, and single-celled critters don't build radio transmitters or anything like that. So it sounds like it takes billions of years before you can have a society that is technologically competent. But let me just take that idea a little bit farther, and that is to say that when I get asked, and I do get asked, what do the aliens look like? It's usually Hollywood types who are asking that. You can say, oh, well, they're going to be little gray guys with big eyeballs with no whites in their eyes and no hair, no sense of humor, no names, no pets, whatever. Yeah, that's what Hollywood tells you, but that's because that's just an extrapolation of what we think we are going to be like in another million years. We're losing our hair. These guys have lost all their hair, whatever. Okay, but it's much more likely that the important things in this century are going to be, well, understanding biology. We are slowly understanding biology, which is very difficult because biology is extraordinarily complex because it's all bottom-up engineering, really. We're going to do that. We're going to have some people who are not living on the Earth anymore. They'll be in colonies in orbit around the Earth or wherever. But we're also, and obviously I think we're going to find life beyond Earth too. But the most important thing that's going to happen probably in this century is the invention of generalized artificial intelligence. Everybody knows that if you spend a lot of money on a computer, you can get one that can beat everybody at chess or poker or Go or a bunch of other games too. But can you spend a lot of money on a computer and get something that can write the great American novel? And the answer is no, not yet. But by 2050, the answer to that question will probably be yes. At least that's what the artificial intelligence people tell me. Okay, maybe they're wrong. Maybe it will take till 2100. Doesn't matter. Those are all the same numbers. So the bottom line here, the extrapolation that you make from all this is to say that the aliens are not going to be little soft, squishy guys running around, right? They're going to be machines. They're going to be machines. And that, I think has consequences for what we do, but also for the way you might think of the aliens.
Wow. Okay. Carl Sagan once called for all sides in the discussion of UFOs to keep an open mind, but not so open, as Sagan said, that your brains fall out. What's your take on this?
Well, this is a perennial subject of my attention because of these phone calls I get all the time. Yeah, I mean, the UFO folk love to hate me. At least I hope they love to hate me. Otherwise, they're not getting enough out of it. Because I'm rather skeptical. I don't think we're being visited. I don't think the evidence for visitation is good at all. It's mostly anecdotal, and that's never any good in science. But on the other hand, it's possible. So I think that you have to be open enough to at least consider it. And the story in the news today and yesterday is that of a new project started by this Harvard astronomy professor, Avi Loeb, who is launching something he calls the Galileo Project. I want to get the words in the right order. I think that's right. The Galileo Project. And his idea is to try and find more Oumuamuas, because he's the one who thinks that Oumuamua might not be just a rock, but also to set up a whole network of small telescopes to look for anything in our atmosphere, in our airspace, maybe alien craft. Well, look, great. I say more power to them, because after all, somebody ought to do that experiment. Nobody really does that experiment. So instead of, trying to evaluate, well, did the aliens crash land at Roswell, or what about that thing that Ralph down the street saw 2 weeks ago and all that sort of thing, try and do an experiment. I think that's a good idea. Do I think that they're going to find that aliens are visiting Earth? No, I don't. But on the other hand, my opinion is it's sort of irrelevant here. The question is, should somebody try? And I certainly think somebody should try. And being as he's a tenured Harvard professor, he was head of the department there at Harvard for a long time, that gives him, if you will, the chops to be able to do something like this, right? If it was a postdoc at some school nobody had ever heard of in, central Paraguay or whatever, I mean, nobody would pay any attention to it. But the fact that this is a very competent and clever guy doing this, I think it's probably a good thing. I think it is a good thing.
Okay. Yes, I had heard of that also. I think that's it for our questions, and we have reached the end of the hour. So I want to thank you again. This was a fantastic presentation, and 2035, I'm putting it on my calendar.
Too bad you can't get the coffee sooner. It could have kept you awake.
And thank you all for tuning in tonight, and I hope you have a good evening.